internista e infectólogo y labora en el Rose Medical Center de Denver y en el Hospital Universitario de Colorado. Es conocido por ser editor médico en la IAPAX y en el AIDS-Infonet.org. Es investigador experto en VIH con múltiples trabajos presentarnos en congresos internacionales y cuenta con muchísimos trabajos, artículos, ensayos y libros. También es investigador principal del Outpatient Study POPS, Center for Disease Control, y es miembro de la Academia Americana de Medicina y de la IAS. Es un educador activo y constante en las universidades y comunidades alrededor del mundo, y la verdad es que estamos muy honrados en contar con su presencia, y siempre ha sido muy entusiasta y siempre es una persona muy interesada en temas de VIH a nivel mundial. Entonces, le agradezco mucho, doctor. So I'm gonna please ask you to share your screen now. ¿Alguien tiene el micrófono prendido que lo pueda apagar, por favor?
Bueno, hola a todos.
Hola, doctor, buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches, doctor John.
Hola, buenas noches, doctor John.
Y disculpe, no puedo estar, estoy...
Yo no te he quitado los micrófonos apagados.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
¿Está bien?
¿Está bien?
Okay.
Todo bien, doctor.
Okay, doctor. Yes.
Entonces vamos a empezar.
Okay.
So, Dr. Gina, thank you so much for the invitation to speak this evening. And again, I apologize that I'll speak in English. I'm always afraid that my Spanish is not sufficient to communicate important ideas. But hopefully after the presentation, I'll take questions in Espanol. So what I'd like what I was asked to speak about was new therapies for people living with HIV who are treatment naive. And so I'm going to frame this discussion tonight around first-line therapies and focus particularly on new data about first-line therapy. And I'll see if so these are my financial disclosures. And so tonight what I'm going to do is to really introduce the subject of antiretroviral therapy in the context of 2018. And to give us a little bit of a historical overview, and then to give an overview about contemporary treatment guidelines, focusing mostly on the US and Mexican guidelines, but also placing this into a global context with reference to World Health Organization, OMS guidelines. Okay. And then I'm going to talk specifically about the medications, the antiretroviral medications, which are FDA approved for initial therapy or for stable switches. And again, I am not going to talk about some interesting and exciting compounds that are in late-stage clinical development, which again, I encourage you to look at in the future discussion. Okay. If I could ask you all to put your speakers on mute.
Bueno.
Okay.
¿Qué pasa?
All right.
Let me see who is talking, doctor. Excuse me. Let me hear. Let me see.
Oye, no, estoy en una clase. Ahorita, bueno.
¿Podrían poner todos sus micrófonos en silencio, por favor?
Por favor, micrófonos en silencio. Está entrando comentarios que no aplican.
De VIH, 3 meses de historia de malasia y diarrea. Malaise, no sé qué es diarrea.
Dr. Young?
Yes, we ready?
Excuse me, see, let me see who's talking.
Dr. Holling? No?
Yes, you can speak, doctor.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to frame this conversation with a representative case. This is the case of a 33-year-old man who comes to your clinic. Well, actually, he came to my clinic last week to initiate care. We've been recently diagnosed HIV positive with a 3-month history of malaise and diarrhea. He had no other significant medical history and came with no other laboratory data. So the only information that we had was that he was HIV positive. So a question I just want to, for you to think about is, when do you start antiretroviral therapy? Do you obtain and wait for laboratory results? Do you wait for CD4 counts and viral loads and perhaps resistance testing, or do you start therapy today? So I want to then introduce ART with the very simple notion that antiretroviral therapy works. But we need to be reflective of the fact that early antiretroviral therapy didn't work so well. It was poorly tolerated, difficult to administer, multiple tablets, often 3 or even 4 times daily dosing with dietary restrictions that extended to 12 hours of the day. Treatment failure was common. Treatment emergent multi-drug resistance was common. And treatments were very expensive. But through global efforts, we got successful therapies, and those successful, even in the earliest days of therapies, we knew that those therapies saved lives. And this is our data from the CDC that shows this remarkable change in the prognosis of people living with HIV in the HIV outpatient study. It shows as patients began to receive combination therapies in 1995 and 96, the death rate plummeted and has remained suppressed. This data goes through 2003. Our cohort data now extends out to 2016, and the death rate is in the neighborhood of 5% of what it was in 1994. So a greater than 90% reduction in mortality with the implementation of population-based therapies. So today's contemporary antiretroviral therapies work. They're well tolerated. They're easy to administer. Many, but not all, are once daily. Many, but not all, are single tablets. They've been shown globally to be cost effective. And in low-income countries, through innovative pricing strategies and intellectual property transfer, the cost can be as low as $75 per patient year. Moreover, our data from the US CDC code and treatment failure with drug resistance is remarkably low and uncommon. So antiretroviral therapies work. We know now from the START study presented and published in 2015 that even in asymptomatic individuals with early HIV infection, that initiation of therapy reduces disease progression, restores immune health, reduces death and cancer and tuberculosis by approximately 40%, even in healthy individuals. And it was this data and others that led to the World Health Organization recommendations that I'll talk about in a moment for universal treatment. We know that when therapies are rolled out, that life expectancy increases. And so this is a cartoon that captures what's happened to the life expectancy of someone living with HIV in a high-income country. And now it's actually estimated that the additional life expectancy approaches that of normal. So we can say that antiretroviral therapies prevents disease, prevents cancer, prevents death, and actually facilitates normal or near normal life expectancy. We also know that antiretroviral therapies works to prevent new cases of HIV infection. We've known now for over 25 years that post-exposure prophylaxis works. We've known for approximately 6 or 7 years that pre-exposure prophylaxis works. And we also know, actually, for a considerable length of time that antiretroviral therapies prevents a vertical transmission or mother-to-child transmission of HIV. One of the most striking examples of this was presented last year at the CROI conference that shows that perinatal infections in New York City, a city with 85,000 people living with HIV, of the 4,000 births in the database, there were no infections in 2015. Globally, this translates to 1.5 million children born HIV-free since the advent of antiretroviral medicines. These are lives saved. And the last piece I'll talk about in terms of antiretroviral therapies working is this remarkable civil society campaign called U equals U, or E equals E in Espanol. And this says that people who are on treatment with indetectable viral loads do not transmit the virus to their sexual partners. And this statement has been endorsed by the CDC, by the National Institutes of Health, and other large scientific as well as community organizations around the world. So antiretroviral therapies work, and as I alluded to earlier, the question about when to start, which often was a large component of these kinds of presentations, I think has been answered scientifically. And probably most globally captured by this 2015 recommendation from the World Health Organization that said that antiretroviral therapies should be initiated in all adults living with HIV, regardless of clinical stage and at any CD4 cell count. A similar recommendation also exists for children and adolescents. So it was 2015 that the World Health Organization recommended treatment for all. It's taken some time for this recommendation to be adopted universally. This is a snapshot taken from last summer showing countries in blue that had adopted the universal treatment recommendation. That the globe is indeed turning blue, but yet there are countries that have not yet adopted universal guidelines, including some in Latin and South America. The US treatment guidelines are also synonymous with the World Health Organization guidelines. These are snapshots from the US Department of Health and Human Service guidelines. The US guidelines adopted universal treatment in 2012. And again, given a very strong and high quality recommendation that treatment is recommended for all individuals, regardless of CD4 count, to reduce morbidity and mortality, and also recommended to prevent transmission. And in Mexico, the Mexican guidelines are very similar, again, recommending treatment for all people who are living with HIV independent of CD4 count or the presence or absence of symptoms. So in that snapshot, both the global US and Mexican guidelines recommend treatment for all. And so what treatments do we recommend? Well, there's a lot of HIV therapies. This is a list that I actually was updated this week with the FDA approval of ibolizumab, which is a monoclonal antibody antagonist of CD4. All told, there's about 30 different medications on this list in various combinations. And for new learners, this could be a daunting task to learn all these names, abbreviations, combinations, and medications. Fortunately, the treatment guidelines actually give us a lot of direction on what medications to use. So these, this is an earlier snapshot, but a snapshot of the WHO treatment guidelines, which recommends tenofovir disoproxyl fumarate plus a cytidine analog, FTC or 3TC, with efavirenz. Also notes that in the winter of 2015, the additional recommendations of the integrase inhibitor dolutegravir, and the recommendation of the use of TDF, XTC, and low dose or 400 milligram efavirenz. Recognizing that we have participants on the call that are in Colombia and Ecuador, I also want to focus a little bit of attention to the World Health Organization medications because they differ a little bit from the US and Mexican options. These are from the US treatment guidelines. From the most recent iteration of this edition was in October of 2017. You'll note that the panel recommends only integrase inhibitor containing or integrase inhibitor based regimens. So dolutegravir plus abacavir or lamivudine, dolutegravir plus tenofovir emtricitabine, the elbictegravir cobicistat tenofovir emtricitabine combination, and raltegravir plus tenofovir and emtricitabine. So 4 different integrase inhibitor-based regimens, 3 with tenofovir emtricitabine, 1 with abacavir lamivudine. And we'll talk about the individual drugs and some recent data about these regimens in a moment. This is from the Mexican treatment guidelines, and I think, can you all see my cursor, my arrow?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, we can see.
So the preferred regimens in Mexico are regimens that use efavirenz, either in fixed dose combination with tenofovir DF with XTC, or using the tenofovir XTC or abacavir 3TC combinations in a 2-tablet regimen. So the preferred regimens in Mexico currently are efavirenz 600 milligrams. And then in the case of where efavirenz is considered to be inconvenient for then alternative regimens listed below are also recommended. So these include abacavir 3TC dolutegravir, or the 2-tablet regimens of tenofovir XTC or abacavir 3TC with dolutegravir. The elbictegravir cobicistat combination we call Stribild is recommended, as well as tenofovir XTC with the integrase inhibitor raltegravir. And then lastly, and I won't show any data on this because they're not reflective in either the US or the WHO guidelines, for patients who cannot take either or any of the efavirenz or integrase inhibitor-based regimens, a regimen with darunavir plus ritonavir can be used. And for sake of completeness, I'll mention that in Europe, this has been approved as a single tablet regimen using darunavir cobicistat. I should point out that in 2016, the WHO included the dolutegravir as an alternative first-line regimen, and around the world, many countries now are adopting dolutegravir-based regimens for preferred first-line treatments, and I'll show you some data regarding this. But it was the WHO's conclusion that dolutegravir, compared to a standard dose of efavirenz, was associated with fewer drug interactions, higher genetic barrier to resistance, and is now being made available at very low cost in a generic single tablet combination. So let me now move to really the sort of the focus of this talk, which was to give you an update on initial therapies in 2018. So we're going back to this case, this 33-year-old man, recently diagnosed HIV positive. And again, this is a real case in my clinic. His CD4 count was 20. His HIV RNA viral load was about 1.5 million. And a question for you to think about is, which antiretroviral treatment do you start in your clinic, in your country? Is it tenofovir XTC with efavirenz, tenofovir XTC with an integrase inhibitor, abacavir XTC with an integrase inhibitor, or something else? Go ahead.
No, we here in Mexico, we start with efavirenz. Mm-hmm. But now we have dolutegravir, and we are going to have strivil.
Mm-hmm.
But almost 90% of the patients have the first regimen with tenofovir, emtricitabine, and efavirenz.
Yeah, and that's true for most countries around the world. And again, there are varying ways that different ways that countries are adopting integrase inhibitors, dolutegravir or elbitugovir and stribil. And Gina, I'll address some of that in a moment. So I took that big list of medications that were FDA approved and just narrowed this list down to the medications that appear in either the WHO, US, or Mexican treatment guidelines. I highlighted bictegravir here with an asterisk because bictegravir is actually not yet part of US treatment guidelines, but there is every expectation that it will be shortly. So for sake of introduction, I actually want to start with the nucleosides. And again, tell me, do any of your countries have access to the new formulation of tenofovir?
No, we still don't have TAF.
So TAF is not yet available?
No, not yet.
So for point of being or trying to stay with the theme of showing you new data, I'll show you that some data around the differences between TDF and TAF. TAF again is a new prodrug of tenofovir, which has dramatically better bioavailability. This has two consequences. First is that there's only 10% of the drug in the pill, so the pills can be smaller. It also allows co-formulations that previously weren't, simply because of the number of milligrams in the tablet. It's associated with lower kidney and bone toxicity, and again in the clinical studies it was shown to be very similar to the older tenofovir disoproxyl fumarate or TDF. In the US, TAF is now available in 4 different co-formulations, one with FTC alone called Descovy, one with rilpivirine, the non-nucleoside, called Odefsey, actually two with integrase inhibitors, one in Genvoya, which is the TAF-containing version of Stribild, and then FDA approved only last month was the Biktarvy combination, shown last with the new integrase inhibitor bictegravir. Here's some of the, I don't know if I can, where that came from. Apologize about the red line. To give you a little bit of an evidence-based discussion, this is data from an older randomized clinical trial that looked at patients who were virologically suppressed on therapy, and they were randomized to continue on TDF FTC or switch to TAF FTC. These were presented by Joel Gallant in 2016. The data, what I didn't show you was that the virologic suppression was the same in both arms, and so there was no difference in viral suppression, and overall clinical side effects were very similar. But changes in GFR were noted, where the patients who received TAF had improvement in their glomerular filtration rates that were statistically significantly better than those who remained on TDF. And then regarding bone density, the patients who were switched to TAF had approximately 1.5% change improvement in their bone mineral density compared to stable bone density in those who stayed on TDF. And so these data have been seen reproducibly in other clinical trials. I should point out that both of these endpoints are markers of disease, and there have not been similar data that suggests that the clinical disease, that is to say new onset kidney failure or new onset bone fractures, have been different. But that may be just a function of follow-up time and such. So TAF has been widely included in treatment in the United States, it has not yet been as widely adopted or available in many other countries. Oh, and one last point, the differences in lipids are shown here. There's a modest, modest increase in lipids when you switch people from TDF to TAF. Again, so increases in total cholesterol, LDL, and triglycerides. And this is mostly because TDF actually has lipid-lowering functions. Okay, so that's TDF and TAF. I do want to mention a little bit about efavirenz. As you all know, it's widely recommended, and Dr. Georgina, as you said, it's the most commonly used initial regimen or component in first-line therapy in Mexico. As you know, dosed once daily, needs to be taken or should be taken on an empty stomach, but now available and recommended by the World Health Organization as in a lower dose formulation called, and now available in the U.S., called Symphilo. Gina, do you know where those lines are coming from?
The guidelines, excuse me?
Are you seeing those lines on your screen?
Yes, you did it with your computer. Yes.
I can erase it.
We can erase it for you.
I got it. There we go.
Oh, there.
Sorry.
There. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay. All right. So a 400 milligram version and co-formulation of efavirenz is now FDA approved and consistent with WHO treatment recommendations. I wanted to just show you some of this 400 milligram data. Let's see here. So this came from a study called ENCORE from quite a number of years ago now, but a study that randomized treatment-naive adults to receive either a 400 or 600 milligram efavirenz with tenofovir DF, TDF, and emtricitabine. And so these are the primary and secondary endpoints of the study, showing that there was no difference in viral suppression and there was a slight difference in the CD4 cell count in favor of the lower dose of efavirenz. Overall, there were fewer patients who had adverse events when they received the 400 milligram dose, shown in this column, compared to the 600 milligram standard dose, and that difference was strongly statistically significant. Moreover, the number of patients who stopped because of side effects was also decreased 2% versus 6%. And this is what led to the WHO inclusion on treatment guidelines. Breaking out these side effects, actually, the differences in any particular area were not statistically significant, but again, the aggregate trend led to the overall improvement seen in the study. So this is what led to the inclusion of the WHO treatment guidelines and subsequent availability in some countries of the 400 milligram dose. Okay, so let me shift gears to integrase inhibitors, in part because this is, I think, where the new data is. This is where the treatment guidelines are evolving, and so I think for many providers and certainly many healthcare systems, this is what's new. As background, I'm summarizing many clinical trials on this one slide, and again, this is why the U.S. treatment guidelines and I would say many European guidelines have shifted the way they have, and this is because the first set of integrase inhibitors, including raltegravir, elbitergovir, and dolutegravir, were actually found to be superior to standard of care comparators. So raltegravir, for example, was superior to efavirenz and superior to boosted protease inhibitor in large clinical trials. Elbitergovir was shown to be superior to boosted protease inhibitors in women or for switch studies. And dolutegravir, again, superior for both comparisons with efavirenz and boosted darunavir. And this is again in large part why the treatment guidelines in the U.S. And in Western Europe have changed. What I'd like to do is just to give you an update of these three, and then the newest integrase inhibitor, bictegravir. Again, much of this data was presented last week or week before at the CROI conference in Boston. So raltegravir was the first of these integrase inhibitors. It's been around now for 10 years, and when launched was dosed twice daily, and now can be dosed once daily, and it has no diet restriction. Again, the details of each specific drug I'm going to not, for sake of time, go through in detail for the sake of trying to show you some of the newer data. For raltegravir, we found out actually last summer with our good friend Pedro Can from Buenos Aires in this large randomized clinical trial in treatment-naive individuals, randomized to receive either raltegravir, the conventional dose, 400 milligrams twice daily, or 1,200 milligrams once daily. This was a 48-week study that went on to 96 weeks. The primary endpoints of the study in brief are shown in this slide. That showed that there was no difference in viral suppression. In addition, no difference in CD4 cell count changes. And this very quickly led to FDA approval of a new formulation of raltegravir, which is dosed 600 milligrams, 2 tablets, once daily. So once daily raltegravir can in fact be administered now. Also important are these data about raltegravir. Again, these were presented at the CROI conference in Boston this year. This is the data. This is a multi-center study, a huge study of 1,800 patients in Africa. It was an interesting study design, and the reason that I'm presenting this is that there has been concern that because integrase inhibitors are so potent, that there might be an increase in immune reconstitution syndrome, IRIS, in patients who received raltegravir or integrase inhibitors. So this study actually started people on conventional 2-drug therapy with a non-nucleoside, or 4-drug therapy that included raltegravir. Again, the interest in this was to see whether there was going to be differences in IRIS. And so some of the data is shown here. This is looking at the incidence of fatal IRIS events, raltegravir in green, and the standard non-nucleoside regimen in orange. You can see that there was a spike in IRIS events early, as we often see in patients who present with very low CD4 count in advanced disease, but no difference between the standard efavirenz-containing regimens or those that contained efavirenz plus raltegravir. And again, in an 1,800 patient clinical trial. So I think this answers in part the question about whether integrase inhibitors are associated with increased IRIS. Sorry, I'm still drawing lines. Okay, so that was the data, most recent data on raltegravir. Just going to mention elvitegravir here, and in part because it's in the U.S. now being replaced by bictegravir. But elvitegravir was the second integrase inhibitor, dosed once daily with cobicistat boosting. Elvitegravir is available with TDF-FTC in the fixed dose combination Stribild, and with TAF-FTC in Genvoya. In the United States, where we have both of these drugs available, nearly all of our Stribild patients have been switched to Genvoya. It's notable or noteworthy that among the integrase inhibitors, this is the one that needs to be taken with food for optimal bioavailability of the drug. Dolutegravir is the third integrase inhibitor. It's dosed once daily. Oh, sorry, that's a typo. Without PK boosting, it's available as a fixed dose combination, a complete regimen with abacavir and 3-TC called Triumec, and very recently available in a 2-drug combination with rilpivirine called Juluca. It has no dietary restriction. As I mentioned earlier, dolutegravir has been recommended by the World Health Organization, and so I want to focus on a number of data points around dolutegravir. So dolutegravir, as I mentioned again earlier, was that it was shown to be superior to efavirenz and superior to boosted darunavir in treatment-naive patients. One of the areas of concern was how to dose dolutegravir in patients who were being treated for tuberculosis. And so this was a large multi-center study that, again, presented by Dooley and colleagues at Croy, where patients were randomized, or patients who were HIV/TB co-infected and treatment naive were randomized to they all received TB treatment, and within the first months of TB treatment, they were randomized to initiate HIV treatment with either standard efavirenz or dose-adjusted dolutegravir. You'll note that the dolutegravir dose in this scheme is twice daily, which is the recommended dose for dolutegravir when patients receive a rifamycin or rifampin-containing regimen. And so the question, there's really two questions for the study. One was, does this dose scheme result in viral suppression at equivalent rates to the efavirenz-containing regimen? And again, reflecting the earlier conversation about IRIS, were there increased rates of IRIS in patients receiving the integrase inhibitor? So this slide just summarizes the virologic and immunologic results. And on the left side are the viral suppression rates. And you can see in blue that dolutegravir patients achieve viral suppression more rapidly than efavirenz. We've seen that now in multiple clinical trials. And after 24 weeks, the rates of viral suppression were the same. So overall, no obvious difference in viral suppression. And immunologically, the changes in CD4 cell counts favored dolutegravir, 150 cells for dolutegravir, 93 cells for efavirenz. The study also did pharmacologic studies or PK studies and showed that the drug concentrations achieved in the twice daily dosing were similar to those achieved with the once daily dosing without rifampin. And then in this slide captures the IRIS events in contrast to the earlier study. I'm showing you non-fatal as well as, I don't know if there were any fatal events in the study, but in the end, no obvious difference in the rates of IRIS between the two treatment arms. So I think now we've got two different large studies showing that with two different integrase inhibitors, the rates of TB-associated IRIS or IRIS in general were not different. And again, I've said this several times. I'm probably overstating it, but dolutegravir is now being shifted as preferred first-line regimens around the world. As of December of last year, Brazil had almost 80,000 patients on a dolutegravir TDF XTC regimen. Botswana, about 50,000. And Kenya is now rapidly scaling up, and it's anticipated that Nigeria and Uganda will also do so. In fact, by the end of 2018, it's expected that there will be more patients receiving dolutegravir in middle and low-income countries than in high-income countries around the world. DTG, TDF, and 3TC. There's only one case of IRIS reported in the 26,000 patients. Again, there's a lot of reasons why that number may be so low, but certainly not a lot of IRIS. And moreover, the rates of patients reporting side effects, gastrointestinal, neurologic, insomnia, and such, were very low. Note that the highest number reported here is 1.3%. So insomnia or sleep disorders reported in approximately 0.5% of people. And the impression that I got in talking to the health minister was that she felt that the drug had been launched had gone very, very smoothly. They also have very large data sets now on pregnancy with dolutegravir, TDF, and 3TC. Okay, so that's dolutegravir. I want to say a little bit about bictegravir. Bictegravir is the fourth integrase inhibitor. It's the second from Gilead. And bictegravir is dosed once daily without pharmacologic boosting and is only available in a fixed dose combination with TAF and FTC. That combination is called Biktarvy. Again, there have been a number of large phase 3 clinical trials presented on bictegravir, and overall it looks very similar to dolutegravir. Here's the summary of a phase 3 clinical trial presented by Jean-Michel Molina at CROI 2018. In this study, patients who were receiving dolutegravir or bacavir and 3-TC, so that's the fixed dose combination Triumec, they were randomized in a blinded placebo-controlled fashion to either continue Triumec or to receive the Biktarvy combination. This is the data that presented for 48-week endpoints. Here are the virologic endpoints. The patients with viral suppression rates were very similar. Those with viral suppression, 94 and 95%. The missing data or no virologic data rates were very similar as well. So no statistical significant differences between virologic outcomes between the Biktarvy versus the Triumec single dose or single tablet combinations. In essence, these represent the two different companies' single tablets for initial therapy. This is a summary of the common side effects seen in the study. And again, the two drug regimens were very, very similar. Overall, although in these kinds of clinical trials, you see side effects that are reported, but not common to see many side effects. Insomnia, importantly, because people talk about insomnia with dolutegravir, it was seen at 5% and 3% in the bictegravir arm. Similarly, there was no difference in the changes in bone mineral density seen in the spine or hip. Okay, so that's a summary. That's a summary of initial therapies or switch therapies using the 4 now different HIV integrase inhibitors. Let me shift gear a little bit because this has become a hot topic, which is the subject of 2 drug therapies. Again, mentioned Pedro Kahn earlier. Pedro really, I think, catalyzed a lot of the interest in this area with earlier studies using lamivudine and boosted lopinavir. And more recently presented data with lamivudine with dolutegravir. These are all early phase studies that have gone, the latter of which has gone on to phase 3 development, but it's still in development. I actually want to focus this conversation and using the DHSS guidelines as a starting point. I'm actually going to focus on the second set of recommendations here. As of October 2017, the US treatment guidelines now note that in patients who are virologically suppressed, that dolutegravir plus rilpivirine may be a reasonable option when one does not want to use nucleosides and when resistance to either dolutegravir or rilpivirine is not expected. So this is the first FDA approved and DHSS recommended 2-drug regimen. And I wanted to just take you through some of the data that pertains to this combination as the drug became FDA approved, only became FDA approved in the US at the end of last year. So the data that pertains to this was presented by Jose Maria Libre from Barcelona at CROI 2017. These data were contained within the SWORD-1 and SWORD-2 clinical trials. So these were 2 parallel large clinical trials, and I'm presenting the summary of their data here. Patients were randomized, patients who were virologically suppressed on a regimen that contained 2 nucleosides and then either a protease, a non-nuc, or an integrase inhibitor. They were randomized to either continue therapy or switch to the 2-drug regimen. The primary endpoint was at 48 weeks with viral load less than 50 copies. I should point out that the study was conducted internationally in North America, Europe, and Asia. Here's the snapshot outcomes at week 48, and the 2-drug regimen in blue, the 3-drug regimen in orange. And there was absolutely no difference in virologic outcomes. Virologic success was at 95% in both arms, virologic non-response at or less than 1%. And again, the adjusted treatment difference showed no difference between the groups. Moreover, subgroup analysis based by age, race, gender, or by country showed no difference in the 2 versus 3 drug regimens. So that led to the FDA approval of the drug late last year. Should also point out that when the group looked at bone mineral density between continued therapy versus the nuke sparing regimen, that there was an improvement in bone mineral density in patients who switched to the nuke sparing regimen compared to those who continued. Point out that many of the patients in the orange arm were receiving TDF therapy. So the effect might be blunted if those patients were receiving TAF, but again, that was not available.
Va a salir en la película.
So that's the new data. So to conclude, I hope that you got a sense that ART therapy, antiretroviral therapies work. Antiretroviral therapies prevent death, prevent disease, prevent transmission. And across the world, antiretroviral therapy is recommended for all, yet not all countries yet have national guidelines that endorse universal treatment. I feel very strongly that antiretroviral therapy should be offered to all people living with HIV as a matter not just of science, but also as a matter of human rights. Recommended treatments around the world for initial therapy start with 3 drug regimens, but around the world they are shifting to include more and more integrase inhibitor containing treatments over the previously recommended non-nuke or PI containing regimens. And emerging data on the use of integrase inhibitors, particularly in co-infected patients with tuberculosis, is emerging, again, supporting their data and safety. And then lastly, 2-drug regimen. The first 2-drug regimen is now FDA approved for stable switches, and there are a number of 2-drug regimens in various stages of clinical development. So I believe that is my last slide. I'll say thanks to the wonderful group in Clínica Condesa. I wish, again, I could be there with you tonight. This is a view from my house in the mountains of Colorado this morning, and I'd be very happy to take some questions.
Yes, doctor, thank you very much first. And we are sorry for the rough start. And I want to ask you 2 questions, and later I'm going to ask you for the other doctors.
Yes.
The first one is, do you have any experience with TAF in pregnancy?
Do I have, so the question is, yeah, do I have experience, well, certainly personally, I don't have experience with TAF in pregnancy. There is some concern about the use of TAF in pregnancy, mostly because the levels of drug are much higher, and intracellular levels of drug are higher despite the lower doses. So, and this is one where I think it's still an area of active investigation. But I tend to rely on the basic idea that the first job is to suppress the virus. So but I think the more relevant question is, in an environment where both TAF and TDF are available, which one would you use during pregnancy? In the US, we tend to be very conservative about the use of medications during pregnancy and tend to stick very closely to national guidance. And I think with that spirit, I would suggest that we stay, that in Mexico or other countries that, stick close to what their national guidelines recommend. There's clearly a larger safety data set with TDF where there really isn't great danger, again, in the context of balancing the risks of viral suppression versus toxicity to the infant. So I think that's really a non-answer to your question. Certainly from my perspective, I'll defer to my obstetrical colleagues for additional advice as I see pregnant cases.
Yes, so we have now in the guidelines, we didn't talk about pregnancy, but we recommend Caletran and Convivir for pregnancy here in Mexico. And now we are using Raltegravir with Truvada. But we have used Darunavir, etc., and we are going well. But we don't have a lot of investigation in pregnancy, so it's difficult to find if it's really secure or useful.
Right. No, it's an excellent question, and I think that I showed you the data from Brazil, but I should also mention that Botswana is rapidly scaling up dolutegravir use, and had reported the results of the first 600 dolutegravir pregnancies in the first 6 months of their experience, and the data there has been very reassuring. So. In the U.S., we have been using either raltegravir or dolutegravir during pregnancy pretty much as a standard, and we use that with Truvada. And our pediatric teams seem to be quite happy with that regimen. But we acknowledge that there's a relative paucity of data about the use of many medications during pregnancy. But I would anticipate a shift in global guidelines away from.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I really hope. And the second question is, we still haven't COVID in Mexico, but I read about the change in creatinine in serum, and it exists any form so I can't difference between renal damage and only elevation of creatinine is we work in clinics, Condesa. It's a clinic for first level of attention, and it's difficult in a clinic like that to know to have a really a very no sé cómo decirlo en inglés, un estudio que sea exacto, fidedigno para medir la función renal.
Yeah, so your question again is about cobicistat and
yes.
on creatinine clearance,
yes.
or at least on creatinine levels. So cobicistat, like actually other medications, which include dolutegravir and actually include trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, compete with creatinine for tubular excretion. And so as a consequence of dosing, you'll see the serum creatinines rise, right? So the first thing to recognize is that is a very quick and reversible effect, and should be stable, should plateau. So for example, with cobicistat regimens or dolutegravir regimens, you'll see the creatinine increase in the first week or two, or certainly the first month of treatment, and then it shouldn't increase thereafter. Any increase afterwards is probably due to a different issue, perhaps kidney injury, for example. And so the simplest pragmatic thing is to appreciate that you'll see these small increases in serum creatinine. Again, using U.S. Units, less than a 0.5 change in serum creatinine is considered usually acceptable. We'd like to see a lot less than that, but again, you see it very quickly and thereafter. There are some blood-based markers that one can use to measure, actually measure creatinine clearance, or one can even do 24-hour urine sampling to measure creatinine clearance directly. Both of those aren't really done on a regular basis, really only done in the case of where there's additional concern about where there's a need to get a true measurement of creatinine clearance.
Okay, so thank you, doctor. And I'm gonna ask you now questions of our chat. First one, they want to know if there's a switch from TDF to TAF, and the renal damage is stopped.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question about for patients who have renal injury on TDF, does the renal injury improve when you switch to TAF? And the answer in general is yes. Certainly, even in patients without renal injury, the GFR improves. And in most, but I hesitate to say all patients who have TDF, certainly patients who have renal injury, not all of it is TDF related, but patients who have TDF injury, yeah, you'll see improvement. And it's certainly part of the rationale for why we have largely switched from TDF to TAF in patients on treatment.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Young. Thank you very much, but for your very interesting lecture. I have a question about the genetic barrier to start patients between dolutegravir and bictegravir. Do you have a comment about that?
Sure. No, it's a very good question. One of the things that I think we've always that has been very attractive about integrase inhibitors in general, and especially about dolutegravir, has been the absence of, or the a very scarce number of patients, treatment-naive patients, who develop drug resistance while on initial therapy. The other comment I'll make first is also that transmitted integrase inhibitor resistance is very rare. In fact, our group published the very first case in the world in 2010. So in the US, for example, transmitted integrase inhibitor resistance only, at least until very, very recently, only occurs in the context of multi-drug resistance. And a report at CROI also looked at transmitted integrase inhibitor resistance from Botswana, and again also found it to be very, very rare. So that is a substrate for why we're interested in the drug or drug family. What we do know about a comparison between dolutegravir and bictegravir comes from the recent phase 3 clinical trials that compare the two. And in both cases, there were no, again, in the one clinical trial that compared them head to head, in neither arm of the study did any of the patients experiencing virologic failure develop drug resistance. Moreover, what's interesting about the integrase inhibitor cases is that not only do the patients not develop integrase resistance, they don't develop nucleoside resistance. So to date, treatment emergent drug resistance in treatment naive patients is I won't say zero, but is extremely rare. And that's, of course, is very, very different than in patients who start on efavirenz-based regimens, where a significant, while where virologic failures occur in low single-digit numbers of patients, but in most of those patients, often two-drug family multi-drug resistance is observed. And so that's a difference, and it's certainly part of the rationale for why the US guidelines and the WHO guidelines recommend the use of integrase inhibitors. But at this particular point, we really don't have any resistance differences between dolutegravir and bictegravir, although we have a substantially greater duration of time and greater number of patients on dolutegravir than bictegravir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Young.
Mi placer.
I have another questions from the chat. What's your option for treatment in elite controllers, or what's your opinion about initiating treatment in them?
Yeah, excellent question, where there's very little good answers. So I think one needs to be careful, or at least needs to be precise about defining elite controllers. If one defines elite controllers as those who are antibody positive but have no detectable virus, then I think that the data set is quite unclear about the benefits of treatment versus the risks of treatment. For individuals, however, who are, let's say, elite controllers, but they occasionally have virologic blips, or those people who have viral loads that are in the 2 log, that's less than 100 range. In those patients, I tend to treat those patients, and I also offer therapy to all of these patients, understanding and appreciate and explaining to them that there's not quite our confidence in the science is not as good, but we know today that the risks of the drugs and the risks of the drugs are lower, and the tolerability of drugs are much improved compared to earlier days. So I tend to favor offering treatment to these individuals, giving them the option to discontinue if they have side effects. But again, the discontinuation for side effects with current treatments is extremely rare.
So I'm going to ask you another question about, it's recently we have this discussion in Condesa about partners of seronegative partners of pregnant women, or or let me explain better. We have patients that are undetectable or on virologic control, and they have a partner that is pregnant. So do you recommend PrEP on those patients, even if it's in virological control?
Yeah, so if a patient, I'll add one other condition to your question, Doctora, which is that the couples are mutually monogamous.
Yes. Yes.
Right? So in mutually monogamous couples, but who are serodiscordant, what I tell them is that HIV prevention can occur with both a condom or by having viral suppression. And pregnancy actually doesn't affect that statement from my point of view. That is to say, again, the data now is robust and has been reproducibly confirmed on multiple continents in multiple sexual orientations. And that is to say that we know that when someone is on treatment and virologically suppressed, that the risk of transmission to the seronegative partner is unmeasurable. Right?
Thank you.
And we use that actually in the context of serodiscordant couples who would like to have who are planning a pregnancy.
Yes.
Right? Because we used to offer PrEP to the seronegative partner, and in some cases some providers still do this, but I think it's really unnecessary.
The discussions comes because we don't have enough evidence in those patients and in couples that are looking to get pregnant. So
yeah, but we have data now from several 100,000 sexual acts without condoms with suppressed positive patients where there's been not a single case of transmission. So I think that the risk, therefore, is probably far less than 1 in 100,000.
Well, and the discussion is because there are almost all males, not women, and maybe that's we think that was a difference. But
well, yeah. So the data actually is quite large on this, and so whether it's male to female or female to male transmission, it's just simply not happened. And again, there's a large heterosexual cohort in East Africa where this has been explored extensively. And again, there's still yet to be a case of transmission. So I feel pretty good about that, but I appreciate that this is a major paradigm shift for us who counsel patients. It may take some time for us as providers to adjust to the new data set. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning in this sort of male to female transmission is remember that the semen contains antiretroviral medications in it. So in a way, the semen is its own pre-exposure prophylaxis. Right? So, but again, I appreciate that this is different than what we saw a few years ago.
Okay, thank you, doctor. Thank you very much. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta?
Dr. John, there is another question of a physician here that is asking about depression in patients. Do you think that dolutegravir is an option for these kind of patients?
Yeah, so the question is about patients with depression, and is dolutegravir an appropriate option?
Sure, sure.
So first off, certainly compared to efavirenz, it's a preferred option, and that's language taken from either the DHSS or the GESIDA guidelines. So in other words, in patients with depression, efavirenz is not a recommended regimen, or at least the guidelines would consider a different regimen. There has been some concern in some cohorts, but certainly not all. In fact, only in a few cohorts where there may be some psychological side effects of dolutegravir. Our group actually reported insomnia with raltegravir, and there've been some reports about insomnia with dolutegravir. But that is a side effect which is different than depression. But I think to date, in the large randomized clinical trials, the depression signal has not been very significant. So overall, again, I would not feel that pre-existing depression is a reason to worry about the use of dolutegravir. I should add that, again, the Botswana groups and the Brazilian groups will give us huge information about that that particular side effect in patients. And again, the Brazilian data set said that psychological side effects were seen in about 0.5% of patients of the 26,000 patients starting dolutegravir. So again, overall, I think the data doesn't say that there's a significant concern there.
What comment? Good evening. I am Dr. Elmer. I'm glad to listen to you, Dr. Young.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
I agree with your presentation and must make comments. I want to comment that in Mexico, until now, the economic factor has been the most important problem related to how to choose the most appropriate ERT for an individual patient. A capable doctor who has patient in his office has to demonstrate to a committee the most appropriate start or change or ART for the patient. It seems that this will change now by decreasing the price of the PAs and the integrase transfer inhibitor.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. The price of integrase inhibitors like dolutegravir in low-income countries has come down dramatically. As I mentioned very early in the talk, the price of TDF-3TC dolutegravir in Botswana is $74 a year. The issue that you point out, though, is that middle-income countries like Mexico or Chile haven't been offered the same degree of price discounts, and so it's much more difficult for these countries to utilize what I will say is the best of the science. So I hope that one, the experience and the volume of the experience and the volume of purchase in low-income countries may allow a reconsideration and renegotiation of prices for countries like Mexico. It's been very clear in our clinics in the United States that when we transitioned from efavirenz to integrases, that both patients were happier, but also care providers were happier because patients were not coming in with side effects. They were not coming in with needing to switch, and they were not coming in with drug-resistant virus. And so there were a lot of health system benefit to this transition. But you're absolutely right that the acquisition price of the drug is critical to being able to use these kinds of medicines. So, perhaps there will be a competition between ViiV Healthcare and Gilead with bictegravir and dolutegravir. I can't speak to that, but I would encourage you and your colleagues and Sensida to continue to advocate for prices that the country can afford. And then hopefully we'll see this transition happen in Mexico soon.
Thank you, Doctor. I agree with your comments.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely to hear you, mi amigo.
Thank you.
¿Otras preguntas?
Dr. Young, I have one more question.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Cruz from Querétaro, Mexico. Thank you for the class. In the elderly patient, what do you think is the best therapy? Is the integrase inhibitors the best for this group?
So thank you for your question. Certainly the issue of elderly patients is a very important one. Around the world, the average age of patients is increasing. So in the US and in Western Europe, the average age now is 50. And so, there are multiple issues or multiple considerations in these older patients. I'll tell you the answer first, and I'll tell you why. So I also think that integrase inhibitors, much like they were or might be in younger patients, are a drug of choice or a family of drugs of choice for older patients, particularly the unboosted integrase inhibitors. And the reason for this is multifactorial. Number one, though, is that in older patients often have other comorbidities, and they often take other medications, which can have drug-drug interactions. And so having drugs with less drug interactions is good. Moreover, the clinical trials data show that there's no difference in the overall performance of older versus younger patients who receive integrase inhibitor therapies. So when one captures the virologic suppression rates, and although I didn't talk much about this, there's actually tends to be maybe a clinically insignificant, but certainly a numerical advantage to CD4 counts when one compares efavirenz to integrase inhibitors. So integrase inhibitors give you slightly larger CD4 cell count increases, another area where older patients are more vulnerable. One other point that is topical for me, I used to spend a lot of time thinking about bone health. And there are at least cohort studies that suggest that when you compare efavirenz to integrase, that efavirenz has a negative effect on bone density compared to integrase. Similarly, boosted protease inhibitors tends to have a negative effect on bone density. These are small effects, but still the trend overall is better towards the integrases. And so, overall, I see no reason why we shouldn't be using integrase inhibitors. And if anything, there are reasons to be using integrase inhibitors in older patients. And again, it has to do with comorbidities and risk of drug-drug interactions.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your excellent presentation. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I think that's all the questions, Doctor. Okay. So I'm gonna give you very, very thankful for your time and your patience, and I hope we hope see you soon in Mexico.
I hope so too. Doctora, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a privilege to be able to speak to so many providers in Mexico. For those of you who have seen me speak before, you should, and especially for those who have not heard me speak before, please know that Mexico, the nation, the people, are very close to my heart. And I hope that I'll be able to visit you in person, face-to-face, perhaps in Condesa sometime very soon. So thank you very, very much, Doctora.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Muy buenas noches.
Muy buenas noches, doctor. Luego platicamos.
See you too.
Gina,
Ay, perdón, no me escuchaba.
¿Tienes algún comentario, sobre todo para las dudas que se han generado acerca de las preguntas? Sobre todo para hacer un webinar, a lo mejor para retroalimentación.
Sí, de hecho, nada más lo que quiero es que terminaran todos el cuestionario, porque no todos han terminado. ¿No? Se cierra hasta hoy en la noche.
Sí.
Pero lo que vamos a hacer es que en el foro de preguntas va a haber retroalimentación de las que tengan dudas, ¿no? Y claro que si hay otra respuesta en la que estemos de acuerdo, se puede corregir, ¿no? La verdad es que es algo que sí tenemos que esperar, nada más que terminen todos, porque aún no han terminado todos de la evaluación.
Oye, Gina, ¿y algún webinar como tal vez de media hora para hacer retroalimentación o comentarios, es posible?
Pues sí, si quieren. Si los demás están de acuerdo, sí.
Sí, yo creo que han surgido varios comentarios que a lo mejor sí vale la pena reunirnos y platicar dudas, comentarios. no sé, cuando tú tengas disponible, creamos la sesión para conectarnos contigo.
Pues si quieren el día martes.
¿El día martes? ¿A qué hora puedes?
En la noche, yo creo que no sé a qué hora puedan todos. ¿A las 10 estaría bien?
Ok, entonces para crear un webinar a las 10 de la noche el martes, los que están escuchando, bueno, ya lo saben, los vamos a enviar un link para que se puedan conectar y podemos discutir acerca de las preguntas y respuestas, podemos retroalimentarnos. Y los que no, les mandamos un link a su correo, de los que ya lo tenemos, creo que ya los tenemos todos. Y les avisamos a través del chat y a través de Twitter y Facebook para que no lo olviden. Y nos vemos el martes a las 10 de la noche. ¿Sale?
Ok.
Bueno.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Y gracias a todos. Esperemos que...
Buenas noches a todos. Gracias.
Buenas noches. Esperamos que este webinar haya sido de interés y les haya retroalimentado un poco y vamos a seguir trabajando con ustedes. Gracias, doctor Elmer, por sus comentarios.
Buenas noches a todos.
Buenas noches.
Hasta luego.
Gracias, Woody. Buenas noches.
Mañana, buenas noches.